Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 2 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card reveal. 3 new cards have been revealed. It looked like for a long time we were only going to get 1 new card ever, but thankfully Blizzard came through and released a couple new cards. So we have a few cards to talk about today, but I have to say, unfortunately, I really don't think they're very good on average. Maybe one has some promise, but I'm pretty sure the other 2 are going to be very, very bad cards. But of course, you still need to see them and you still need to hear about them because maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can prove me wrong and show me why these cards are fantastic. So here's how we're going to do this, guys. First off, I'm going to talk about each of these cards in pretty great detail. But if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of time and you just want to see the cards and you want to get a really rough overview, I am going to do some quick reviews at the very end of the video where I rate each card from 1 to 5 stars. You can find a link to that point in the video in the description below. Of course, I hope you'll hang out and listen to me ramble about these cards for the next 15 minutes. But if you don't have time, I totally understand, and that's why I'm providing that convenient link for you. But all that said, let's go ahead and jump into this card review. Up first is a new rogue minion called the Plague Scientist, a 3-mana card. It's got 2/3 in stats, and it has combo give a friendly minion poisonous. So a lot to talk about with this one, and this might actually be a decent card, although I still have some pretty significant doubts. So first things first, outstanding arena card. Almost undeniably going to be fantastic in arena. Being able to give a minion that's already on the board poisonous makes this almost a cheaper Vile Spine Slayer in a lot of ways, because you typically have 1 or 2 little minions lingering around in arena, so there's always going to be those turns where you can give a little tiny 1/1 poisonous and destroy a Bog Creeper, and you essentially win the game, and Rogue already has so many great hard removal tools in arena. It's going to be fantastic there, but this is really primarily intended to be a standard format review and how these cards are going to perform in Constructed, and when it comes to that, I don't see as much of a place for Plague Scientist. Now clearly, when this works, when you're able to play it really cheaply for 3 mana, when you've already got a natural combo happening, which isn't that hard for Rogue and Constructed with things like Backstab and all the different coins and so on and so forth. But when that happens and you're able to use that Patches, for instance, or maybe a really cheap Swashbuckler to trade into something really large and take advantage of this poisonous, that's going to be incredible. There also might be some combo potential giving poisonous to something like Wild Pyromancer and then activating that Wild Pyromancer. Crazy sick combo. Both of those clearly very high output plays that can win you games that are going to be good if the deck supports it. But the problem for Plague Scientist right now, as far as I can tell, is that there isn't really a rogue deck necessarily that supports that. There's not really like a removal-based rogue deck or maybe a tempo rogue deck that has a lot of minions out on curve consistently. Typically, rogues' early game minions are much spottier in when they see play. And frankly, a lot of them, like SI7 agents, are already being used for early game cheap chip kind of removal, so they don't necessarily suggest that you need a card like Plague Scientist, because you've already got the Backstabs, the Eviscerates, the SI7 pings, so on and so forth. Now, things like SI7 wouldn't be a terrible target for Plague Scientist, but what I think is going to happen with this card in a majority of games that it's tried to be played is that it's going to be one of those cards you get in the late game and you don't really have a minion on board already, so you kind of just maybe play a card down and you have to play the Plague Scientist for a tempo body, and sure, you give your Gadgetzan Auctioneer poisonous, but who really cares? And of course, there could be new decks evolve, obviously, but the same rules apply. If you get this card into the late game, when you're less likely to have lingering stuff on board, it just gets harder and harder to use. So it becomes one of those cards that's often really, really dead without a small charge card like Stone Tusk Boar, for instance. But who wants to run that in your deck, right? So beyond like Patches and some early game tempo rogue style shenanigans, I just don't see where this card really fits. I think it's going to just fall in the gaps a little bit in Constructed and not really have a good place or a good turn or a good deck to support it. So even though from a raw statistical standpoint, like the stats for the cost are fairly okay, they match up with Emperor Cobra, which we've seen before, but of course the combo here is active. You give the poisonous charge essentially with a minion that's already on board, unlike Emperor Cobra, which just sits there. So clearly a much better card than that natural comparison, and really probably more like Crackling Razor Maw, for instance, where you're giving something to a minion already on board, and that card's been really strong. This one's clearly not statted quite as well as Razor Maul and not as flexible as Razor Maul. So feels much more limited than a card like that. So again, just I don't think the pieces all fit together here. In a perfect world, in a perfect deck, this could be good. But beyond that, I think it's just going to be a little bit too awkward for everything else. So I like the idea of this card. The artwork is really awesome too, by the way. But unfortunately, I think this one's just going to fall short. Speaking of cards which look like they're going to fall short, we have a new Shaman weapon called the Icebreaker. It's a 3-mana weapon with 1 attack and 3 durability. So that right there off the bat is terrible. This is worse Light's Justice for 3 times the mana cost, right? It's pretty bad stats for its cost, but it does have an effect, which so far also seems terrible. Destroy any frozen minion damaged by this. So theoretically here, you use Frost Shock, which is really one of the only freezes available to Shaman naturally right now. And then you attack a minion with Ice Barrier, and your Ice Barrier essentially becomes an Envenom Weapon rogue hero power, right? It's instant kill, much like an Envenom Weapon would be for a rogue. But clearly the first problem here is there aren't a lot of freezes in Shaman. Now, everybody out there is going to say, well, we don't know what cards are coming out. Absolutely right. Shaman could be getting 10 freeze cards this expansion that support Icebreaker. So I'm going to assume that's the case. Because right now, if we don't assume that, this card is absolute garbage because Shaman doesn't have a good way to freeze minions consistently. So, I mean, yes, there are some minions and stuff. There are other ways to get freezes. I understand there are a couple ways. But still, not enough consistently, not enough to support a deck. So in that world that we live in today, Icebreaker is just absolute junk. Immediate disenchant. But assuming Shaman gets... Assuming Shaman gets more tools to freeze stuff in this new world that we're presuming, even when you look at Icebreaker in that context, I still don't think that this is a very good weapon. Simply because, at the end of the day, it's actually really slow. I mean, if you think about Envenom Weapon for Rogue, right? That's another 3-mana card that gives you a couple single target removal options. You can, kill 2 things, basically, with Envenom Weapon and your hero power. And this is similar in a lot of ways. You can kill 3 things, if they're frozen, of course. So that's the first problem. It's a really big condition on this one that Envenom Weapon doesn't have. So Envenom Weapon is much more consistent and much more reliable than Icebreaker. And it should be noted, by the way, Envenom Weapon doesn't see play in Constructed. It's not a card that gets played hardly at all in Constructed. So it's not like it's a defining card. And I'm making the argument that Icebreaker is considerably worse than Envenom Weapon. So if it's worse than a card that already doesn't see play, it's going to be really, really hard to make this one work. So super conditional. Even when the condition is satisfied and something is frozen, you're still only getting to destroy 1 minion per turn, because this doesn't inherently have Wind Fury. So 1 minion per turn, so it takes 3 turns to actually get any removal out of this. And, are you going to be able to freeze things 3 turns in a row? That makes it even more inconsistent, because you might not want to freeze. You might not have the mana to freeze. So it just seems to me like there are a lot of inherent problems with making this thing actually work. And then even when it does work, you still have to take damage from the minion that you attack, which is problematic. It's also a problem for Envenom Weapon. So when you run into that Tyrian Forge Ring to kill it, you're still taking 6 damage to the face. So that's the downside too. Now, Shaman does have access to healing, but you don't always want to use it on a card like this. And then there's other turns where this is probably just a ping because you didn't have a freeze available, or you need to kill a 1-health thing, and then you spent quite a bit of resources as far as a card in your deck and kind of an exorbitant amount of mana for what you're getting. So it just feels like this one's going to be very hard to utilize, even in a deck built to support it. I still don't think it's giving you enough return on your value, just because of those consistency issues and the speed with which it actually accomplishes things. I mean, most people would just rather have a 3/3 weapon, right, that didn't have some sort of default freeze effect or default assassinate effect, because you'd rather just have the stats on the weapon. So you can't apply pressure with this one. It's a super control card in a meta historically that's always tended towards more aggro and more tempo than this card would ever seem to support. This is not going to do work against the Pirate Warriors of the world, of course. So this card to me falls short in every single way. Stats for cost, the effect seems weak, and the effect seems incredibly slow. And of course, right now, this effect doesn't even seem to match its class, which is really problematic, but we're just assuming that can't possibly be the case. So maybe this is one of those filler cards to make Molten Blade worse because somehow Molten Blade was too good, maybe? I don't think that's the logic. Or maybe this is just put in the game right now to set up some future cards we haven't seen yet, or maybe even future expansions down the line. And there's going to be some cool way to utilize this, because as it stands right now, I just can't imagine this was a good design in Blizzard's mind, and it looks like a totally unplayable card. So let's move on to the third unplayable card here. This is the Ticking Abomination that has caused quite a storm of memes, because for a while it looked like this was going to be the only card ever revealed for Knights of the Frozen Throne, but of course that's not the case. We got a couple extra late last night if you're watching this in real time. But this is a 4-mana, 5/6 minion, which, you know, right off the bat, solid stats for a 4-drop. Obviously, it's, you know, vanilla +1/+1, so it's like a Chillwind Yeti with some extra stats. But this Death Rattle is disastrously terrible. Deal 5 damage to your minions. It's not deal 2 damage to all minions like we've seen with Abominations in the past. This is straight up deal 5 damage to your minions only. So if this dies while you have a board, your board is getting wrecked. It's getting Dragonfire Potioned, right? So the worst possible outcome. So clearly, in a vacuum, that Death Rattle is not worth the +1/+1 in stats that you would get with just a Chillwind Yeti. So you have to use this card in some sort of deck that supports that Death Rattle. And it's not going to be a Death Rattle N'Zoth deck, because you definitely don't want this guy popping out with your N'Zoth, because he'll kill all your other Death Rattle minions. So it doesn't really make sense there. One idea, of course, is egg-style decks. You've got the Devil's Roar Egg, the Nerubian Egg, eggs that like taking damage, for instance. This could certainly be an activator in those kinds of decks, but I actually still don't think this card fits well in the traditional egg deck we've seen, which are much more aggressive and try to utilize those decks in the early game by, you know, taunting them or buffing them. And this one just feels like it'd be too slow of a 4-drop for those kinds of decks, because usually the mid-game cards in those decks are really more about being finisher pieces than pieces to establish a board. And you don't even necessarily like destroying your own eggs. You kind of like forcing your opponents to do it if you can, and using those bodies for things like Savage Roar and Druid, for instance, even if they don't get destroyed. So I don't even think this is the kind of card an egg deck would really end up wanting to run. Some people have thrown out things like Silence Priest using this card, but it's clearly way worse than huge Razor Leaf in Silence Priest, so it's not even going to fit in Silence Priest. You'd much rather have the Ancient Watcher and the huge Razor Leaf to set up those silences. So ultimately, I don't know where this card fits. It's one of those things that it feels like just a filler card that, you know, thematically it's really funny. It's an abomination with a bomb in its stomach, so it's a ticking abomination that's going to blow up your board, that kind of thing. But ultimately, even if this was a 6/7, I don't know that it would even see play in Constructed, because it just feels really, really disastrous if it goes wrong, and puts you in a lot of awkward situations when you play it, because you basically play it and you can't play minions next turn. Like, that's not a good spot to be in most of the time in Hearthstone. So as far as an arena card, I don't even think it's good in arena. Some people are saying it's going to be decent in arena. I don't even think that's the case. It's just going to way too often destroy your board and cause you a lot of problems when trying to play stuff. So I think all around this is a very, very disastrously terrible card. And unfortunately, it was kind of the kickoff for the Knights of the Frozen Throne reveal season, which left a lot of people, myself included, pretty disappointed for a very long while. The Ticking Abomination is a ticking time bomb of frustration in the Hearthstone community, it turns out, but ultimately a very, very weak card in my mind. Okay, so those are my detailed thoughts on all of these cards. So now what I'd like to do is just real quickly run through each card and give it a star-based review from 1 star to 5 star based on how good, generally speaking, I think this card is going to be in a constructed standard format. So up first is the Plague Scientist. I think this is a 2-star card. After that is the Icebreaker. I think this is a 1-star card. And then finally, the Ticking Abomination. This is another, unfortunately, 1-star card. So not a lot of stars to go around for these cards today. I don't think these are very good ones. I'm excited to see what's next for Knights of the Frozen Throne. So there you go, guys. That wraps up my part 2 card review for Knights of the Frozen Throne. If you have any thoughts, comments, questions on these cards, observations that I missed, cool synergies I didn't see, if you just want to share your take, of course, leave it in the comments below. I love to read everything you guys have to say. You teach me more than I ever teach you, so leave those comments. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.